I think he would have been arrested 10 years ago. Absolutely. It was corruption within Suffolk County between the district attorney and the police chief. I think that was the absolute brick wall that pushed out the FBI, that subverted anybody caring. Dominic Varone, the initial lead investigator on the case, was tossed out and, sort of threatened without his pension or whatever. And I think it was all just to protect the corruption going on between James Burke, former police chief, and Thomas Spoda, the district attorney. And they would just hide in their own dirty laundry. But they were willing to do that at the expense of allowing a serial killer to continue to be a predator on the island.
That's Raul Montero, a researcher, advocate, and journalist who's known online as CatchLisk. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Raul Montero, who grew up on Long Island, spent many years privately researching the Long Island serial killer case after 4 victims were found on Gilgo Beach in 2010. Now, at least 11 or more, depending on how you count it, victims have been identified in the killings, and Rex Heuermann, a Long Island architect, has been arrested as a suspect in the case. This is the second episode in our conversation with Raul. During his research on the case, Raul searched for ethical, transparent, and accurate advocates and researchers online who were looking into the case, and has built a community that's really dedicated to identifying missing or murdered marginalized victims, some of whom were connected to the Long Island serial case, and some who are not. Raul has also developed deep relationships with some of the loved ones of the victims. Over time, he's become frustrated with many of the inaccuracies that have become common beliefs about this case and others, and dedicated himself to setting the record straight. One of the things Raul has done is built an amazing map of missing persons cases across the country. Raul maintains that database online and is working his way through state by state. What he's collected includes way more than what the federal government actually holds on to in their database called NamUs. Today, in the second part of our discussion, we're going to discuss the murders, and we're also going to discuss the case. But we're also going to spend some time talking about missing individuals across the country, many of whom were marginalized and don't get enough attention. Well, I think there's in my mind, just putting my reporter hat on, I think there's a slightly different equation if I'm sort of like the killer. And it's not so much that their family doesn't care about them, but the family is not going to have the juice to get the attention, to get, or the political influence, or more importantly, that when people hear the word sex worker, I know you mentioned sex worker or survival worker because there are people who are doing it for their survival, and there are people who do it because they enjoy it. And when they hear the word sex worker, it breaks the narrative. And I even in a case like Breonna Maitland, where you have a middle-class girl in Vermont, the moment someone suggested, which we don't really even have much evidence for, that she was involved in drug use, the attention just went.
Absolutely. And that's a systemic problem. It's a generational problem. It is embedded in our collective mindset as Americans. It is what it is. It's terrible. I think with the Long Island serial killer, I think LISK is an absolutely sexually driven deviant, whereas it's more than just the need to have sex. That in and of itself can be innocuous as long as it's consensual and nonviolent. I think when it came to LISK, it encompassed so much more. And I think with him, his preferences were varied and they changed, almost like sampling something new. As disgusting as that sounds, it feels even more disgusting to say it. Which is why you have a spectrum of classifications on Ocean Parkway. You have Peaches, who's African American. You have Asian Doe. We don't know how they identified themselves, but they were found in women's clothing. So they could be gay, they could be trans, or preparing for trans. You have the other five that are 5'2", 110 pounds. For me, I keyed into the hazel eyes. On my map, I make, even to this day, it could have probably, most likely, may not have anything to do with LISK, but hazel eyes is a thing for me, and I'll make a hazel green icon for it. I think the hazel eyes means something to him. I still believe that. He has hazel eyes. His daughter has hazel eyes. So I think there's a catalyst to that. But then there's a wide variety of possible. Sugar Bear, who's 6'5", African American, a drag artist, and I think LISK was trying everything he can because he was enabled to continue to get away with it. He wasn't being caught. There was no heat on him until 2020.
Well, I also think that there's a misconception about serial killers that people have. And I think one of the misconceptions people have is that they have the same type. And I think some of that misconception comes from like a self-defensive thing that we have where we want to say we're not the type of fill in the blank. But the reality is, like, you find a lot of variety. Israel Keys is an example. Even Ted Bundy, even though he had
a type.
Type.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bundy was very opportunistic, and that's the other thing.
And I think too, it's just like every other human being on the planet. Like, we have varying degrees for variety, and there are things that we like, and that's not just a sexual thing. But I think the thing that's hard for people is that, oh, these people are like a lot more like us than we think they are.
Well, I think our biggest mistake as a rational society is to believe that serial killers exist within our square box of rationality. They do not. That's why anyone who sits there and says MOs don't change, I can't engage with, because I can prove it out of just 10 serial killers off the top of my head. Well, then they say signatures don't change. Well, signatures do change. They can change as often as an MO, and signatures are the stuff of Hollywood. You very rare do you get a signature in a serial killer.
Yeah, and just defining the difference. An MO is your modus operandi. It's the things that you do to get away with the crime.
Yep.
Signature may be a unique thing that you do that is not necessary to commit the crime, right? And it's more of a ritual for you. And I think that's a misconception a lot of people have, that MO is stable. It's not. It's based on efficiency. It's based on, circumstance. Where are people? Where am I? What's going on in the news these days? What technology exists out there? So inevitably, MO is going to change. And
if you're smart, you change your MO.
Yeah, and signature over time is going to develop. And we certainly see in this case that, there are clearly some victims who are dismembered. I'm sure that served a purpose. There are clearly some victims who are not dismembered. But I think, one of the things people had a difficult time with in the beginning, and I know some folks in the FBI who worked on the case in the second phase of the FBI being there, but one of the things that one person from the FBI told me was that some people in law enforcement had a hard time wrapping their head around, they could connect the Gigolo four, because they were, found near each other. They were in burlap sacks. They were strangled. the dismemberments, may have been in multiple locations, didn't have burlap sack, there wasn't always a sack. And they were saying some of the law enforcement were having a hard time wrapping their head around the possibility that it could be the same killer, but killers, like the rest of us, change our behavior. I change my commute because traffic is different. All these different things.
Yeah.
Today I want vanilla ice cream. Tomorrow I want strawberry. And so I think people have a hard time wrapping their heads around those.
Well,
But there are commonalities between the victims he chose, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you look at just the Gilgo 4, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber, anywhere from 4'11" to 5'2", 5'3", 110 on average, but they all had hazel, bluish green eyes. And then you look at, and they were just intact. And then you look at,
all were in the sex trade too.
Yeah. Right. Then you look at Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor, who were dismembered, but they also had the same physical characteristics, especially the eyes. And then you start to go, people would say, well, it's dismemberment versus disposal intact, and it's two serial killers. Well, no. And I don't mind having, an intellectual, nuanced conversation about it, but MO changes, signatures. There's only a handful of experts on Richard Cottingham, and even those experts can tell you there is no signature.
Who is he? Cottingham?
Richard Cottingham is the Times Square torso killer who has pretty much admitted to about 100 murders, although he's not been convicted of that many. He's 17. No, that's Rifkin. Less than that, but Cottingham changed his MO all the time. Cottingham was opportunistic. Cottingham will drive through, a town in New Jersey and chat up a housewife and kill her. He was incredibly opportunistic, but he was also viciously violent. But there's still no signature for Cottingham. He's strangled, he's stabbed, he blunt force trauma, he beheaded, he set fire. It's
probably more of a factor of, not just getting away, but also, personality, right?
Yeah, it's personality, it's time and circumstance. Cottingham was in the 70s, according to him, late 60s, 70s, and 80s. He went to jail in 1980. Rifkin had a particular type and MO for the most part, and a sloppy, disorganized killer. Richard Schulman had a particular type. He would pick up sex workers from Schulman lived in Long Beach, Long Island. He was a postal worker in New York City. He picked up sex workers in Yonkers and would discard them. And then you have LISK, who outlived them all. Had in my opinion, had an awareness of everyone that came before him, and I validate or justify that by saying the only letter he ever responded to in jail was to the smiley face killer, a happy face killer, Keith Jesperson. So he had an awareness of his peers. And that this is certainly my opinion.
So you're saying that is the only person Heuermann responded to?
Yep.
Was the happy face killer?
Yep.
Wow.
I mean, he may have responded to his family and stuff that I don't know, but
I'd never heard that before.
Yeah, that letter came out, and I had it validated, of course, by the podcaster who put it out there. And it's legit. It's been validated. It's out there as public knowledge. And
what did he say?
Well, this is where my hashtag no butter for Rex came from, because Rex was complaining about not having butter for his bread in jail. Poor thing.
Sort of the least of my worries at that
Exactly.
point.
And I found it all just, confounding, because if you're saying you're innocent, I guess you can complain about no butter in jail, but the only person you reply to is a serial killer. I mean, that's just a conundrum for me. But But that just to me shows how self-aware he was of himself. And that's also validated in the most recent superseding bail document, because he had an awareness. He had an awareness of what
Yeah,
he's done in the
John Douglas's book, The
yeah.
Cases That Haunt Us.
And he also had an awareness of missed opportunities or not as perfect executions of his
Yeah, or
plan.
execution. Yeah. I mean, he talked about next time I should do X or Y.
Yeah.
I'm curious, having the relationship with the victims' families, studying the case, looking into other cases. There are two things I wanted to ask you. How far do you think these go back? And if you're comfortable speculating, how high do you think really three things, the number could be? And what do you think we can do because I have a feeling it's going to be a shocking number. What do you think we can do to better protect marginalized victims?
So I'll say the last question for last, because that's the powerhouse question. I personally believe he escalated to murdering human beings in the early 80s, which puts him, it could put him as young as 18 years old. It's earlier than the FBI standard of 25. But Sandra Castilla in 93 puts him at 23 years old, 65, 75, 85, 95, yeah, about 27 years old, 28 years old, which is right there in the prime spectrum of, according to the FBI, of when serial killers escalate to human murder. I believe that there's more than that. I believe Judith Ramona Velaz, who is 5'2", hazel eyes, strawberry blonde hair, also in 93, last seen on 10th Avenue, 11th Avenue, 30th Street, a mile away, barely from his office in 93. I believe she's a LISK victim. And as far as a count, I think for me, I think a modest account is 60 plus.
Modest.
Modest
Would be 60.
I personally put him at about 100 plus. I think there's enough to go through. And I've documented it all on like my possibles list and my Rex timeline database. And they're all there. And there are reasons why I believe, and certainly many of them can be crossed out or overlap with, domestic violence or happenstance, which is such a cruel way to say it. But I think there's something there. Wherever someone is on my possibles list, there's a location for Rex Heuermann, not far away.
That's frightening.
And that is what's frightening. That's what keeps me up at night often. And as far as what can be done, I think that's such a bigger question that deserves a whole lot more time to really discuss with not only myself, but many other people that are even more nuanced than I am. But I think the first thing we need to do is remove stigmas. Like, remove all the stigmas. Stop dehumanizing people for their race, their religion, their occupation, their social status. I think when it comes to sex workers, stop using the word prostitute and hooker. Like, it's crude. And because you're from a generation where that was the word, doesn't give you a free.
You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of when my dad was in Vietnam. This drove him crazy. There were all sorts of phrases that the soldiers would use for Vietnamese.
Yeah.
I'm not going to repeat them right now, but they're a common part of dialect still, which is frightening.
Yeah.
But they would use them, and my dad said, well, the purpose was to dehumanize them, so it made it easier to kill them. And I feel like we dehumanize people, like words for Black people, words for Native Americans, words for people who are in sex work. I'm sure people can think of many of those words, which I don't want to say, but it makes it easier to look away when
Exactly.
something bad is happening to them, whether it's they're not able to get housing, they don't have water, or they die.
Well, that's why it's so important. And I've been, I get ridiculed on this every once in a while recently, in fact, say their names. That's why we say their names, because it's more than saying that any victim is a mother, a daughter, a niece, a sister, whatever. That victim is who they are. They are them too. We can sit there and say, Maureen is a mom, Maureen's a sister, Maureen is a daughter, Maureen's a sister-in-law, a niece, a cousin. But Maureen is Maureen.
She's a human.
Maureen belongs to Maureen and her family. Jessica belongs to Jessica and her family. Shannon belongs to Shannon and her family. As committed as I am to all of them, they don't belong to me. They hold a place in my heart, but
I would slightly dispute that, because I would say that in the ideal world, they all belong to all of us because they are humans like us. But where I feel like that's not necessarily the case is when people dehumanize them or try to take advantage of them or other things like that. But in the perfect world, they would all belong to us. That I would feel, like you talked about before, crying at the movie, that I would feel that same sadness when I think of Valerie Mack or Jessica Taylor, because something, and I really believe this, and I think that's part of the reason why I talk about or have conversations with people in these cases. I feel like every time we lose a Jessica Taylor, or we lose even Brianna, or we lose a well-known case like Abby Williams and Libby Germain out in the Delphi murders, or we lose people, like Melissa Montoya. We had one of her friends, she was lost in the Navajo reservation, and for 23 years there wasn't an article written about it until this year. And we all lose something, because humans are so unique, and we lose something so special when anyone leaves us, because it cannot be created. There will never be another. So I agree with you. There's a special place for the families, but I think we should feel that sense of loss when someone is unfairly taken away.
I mean, I know I feel it. I'm often chastised by, critics for, being too emotional, too drawn to any of them. And all I can say is so.
I think it's possible to love somebody you've never met.
Yeah, I care very much for all of them. I care very much for any of the missing people that I work with their families. I care an incredible amount for them. When LISK was arrested was probably the last time I did a full grocery shopping, because I'm a little bit bougie and I like a full stock of nice.
O'Reilly. You've got questions? O'Reilly Auto Parts has answers. Need a pro you can trust? We've got that too. No matter what you need, our professional parts people have the training and expertise to help you do things right. Deep automotive knowledge, just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people. O'Reilly Auto Parts.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
You've You've got questions? O'Reilly Auto Parts has answers. Need a pro you can trust? We've got that too. No matter what you need, our professional parts people have the training and expertise to help you do things right. Deep automotive knowledge, just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
These things. And I haven't really
And
done
after
that.
my own part.
Yeah, like I haven't done any of that since then. And I'm not crying martyrdom. I'm not. I have a little belly, so I'm clearly eating. But it changed everything. And
Can I
I
ask
don't want.
a question about that?
Yeah.
Do you believe, and I know in the last 2 years they had an intense search and identified him. Do you believe that law enforcement treated these cases the same way they would have if these were people from middle class families? And part of the reason where my question is coming from is almost a deeper place than the cliche. Because I remember when I was in New York, Jonathan Levine, who is a teacher, was killed. We ultimately found out by one of his students. And I was in the police shack, which is on the second floor of NYPD headquarters, and it's where all the reporters were. And I remember getting the call from somebody in the Deputy Commissioner for Public Information's office who said, "We have a real red ball." And what he meant was this was going to be politically on fire and that they needed to solve this very, very quickly. And you don't hear that about every case. There is a clear, when it comes to the police department, there is a clear ranking.
Yeah.
And, I talk about this often, being out on a crime scene and a detective saying to me there were NI8, or was it NHI, which meant no humans involved. And like in that example, it was actually a sex worker who was transsexual and whoever their killer was, which they didn't. And
Look, you look at the LISK case from the beginning, you had the generational ignorance. I'll really give it that nice of a stamp of Dormer and Verone basically saying to the public,
Dormer and Verone.
Dormer was the police commissioner and Dominic Verone was the lead investigator in the initial onset of the LISK case, where they said to the public, you don't have to worry. These were sex workers, basically. I'm paraphrasing. That the line of work that they were in is sort of the reason why they were murdered.
Does that mean like you don't have to worry?
Your daughters are safe as long as they're right. Your daughters are safe if they're not sex workers, basically. And it can be a rubber stamp to a generational dialect, but it's still insensitive. And that has permeated the entire case ever since. Shannon was not only a sex worker, an escort, but she had bipolar. Like all these labels started being stamped upon these victims. And it just meant that your average daughter, white girl, blonde hair, blue eyes, is safe. Well, they're really not.
No, not by any stretch of the imagination. Because if you listen to the stories of some of these girls, they are your average daughter who ended up in.
That's why I think like your episode with Nicole Petito was so profound, because both Nicole and Joe, through their foundation, really devote time, attention, empathy, love, care, and money to bringing awareness to more marginalized people, biracial, people of color, indigenous, everyone that is physically appearing the antithesis of what Gabby Petito was. And their ability to take every missing person in their perspective is Gabby, is profound and beautiful, and people don't see it for the pure beauty that their intention is. So I've spoken with Joe on a Twitter space once, about a year or so ago, and his commitment to enhancing the public's awareness and getting as much attention, if possible, that Gabby had gotten to any other marginalized person, he would do that all day and night. The foundation would do that all day and night. And that is what is needed too. Like, society has to stop thinking that, and this is going to come out really polarizing, but society's got to stop thinking that only white, blue-haired, blonde people matter, because all people matter.
Well, there was this moment, and I think there's a natural human tendency to like people who look like me.
Yeah.
I worry more about, but like even in a recent episode with Kristen Middleman, who's the co-founder of Othram, which is the DNA and forensic genealogy company. And she said something that took me aback, because part of the reason why I wanted to have her on, I had seen her in another interview where she answered one question about why they do what they do. And she said to me, both, I think in the episode and then privately before, we're not doing our job as Othram until there is equity for everyone. And I thought that was such a powerful thing. I wanted to ask you, you said this would be controversial. This will be controversial. I wanted to ask you, so I made a donation to the wife and children of Rex Heuermann, because I view them as victims as well. And, afterwards there was an uproar made in the New York Daily News, New York Post. I got a lot of crap about it. Not that I care, because, I don't care. I do what I do. And, it did cause my behavior to change, because I think what some people don't know is I also afterwards made donations to some of the victims' families, but I did it anonymously, because I was like, I can read the New York Post headline where they're going to say I was making these donations because I got crap about that. Right. So, hey, New York Post, guess what? Did that too. And I wanted to ask you, like, do you also consider, whether it's Heuermann's family or others like that, I think of Carrie Rawson, who's Dennis Rader, the BTK killer's daughter. Do you consider them victims as well?
So before Rex was arrested last July, around last February, I began to have a friendship with Carrie. And I have profound respect for Carrie. Like, I admire her so much. She's helped enhance my awareness. She's helped enhance my humanity.
Do you know the first person I messaged about Victoria Heuermann?
That's the first person I thought of too.
Yeah. I sent a message to Carrie and I said, I don't know what to do to help, but hey.
Because I admin a Facebook group, and I have my own Twitter, which wasn't as big then as it is now. And I was a mod in another group, and I had relatively respectful standing in other groups. I felt it was important that as a community, we don't attack Rex's family. I felt it was important to state clearly that Asa, Victoria, and Christopher were victims. Certainly not victims that lost their lives, but victims nonetheless. And I made sure that in those groups, that standard was respected. I allowed people to voice a dissenting opinion, but I would never allow it to get out of control. I would give warnings, and a few times I've had to remove people. I wanted to extend that empathy. I wanted to be, for me, a more equitable human being, a more equitable advocate, and give them that respect.
I had a coworker that I worked with a couple years ago, and this eventually caused her to leave her job. The anxiety was enormous, but she had found that her brother-in-law had been arrested by the FBI for child sexual abuse materials. I've met plenty of people who have found themselves in similar situations, and certainly I've probably spoken to hundreds of family members in the hours after they found out that their son, brother, whoever was just arrested for murder. And, like I had a job to do, but man, it was so hard to sit in that mom's living room. I remember one in Brooklyn in particular where I had her son's rap sheet in my back pocket. And she was telling me about him. And I didn't realize that the police had not told her yet that he was arrested. And man, we were all crying by the end of the one. But I think sometimes we can just be so selective in our empathy and have such a difficult time putting ourselves in other people's shoes.
I absolutely agree with you on that. And I think to drill down a little bit deeper, equitable in our empathy, but I also think that people are selective in their anger. And I think that is a bit of a problem in this case, because
What do you mean by that?
You see these factions now where there's hair evidence on almost all of the victims from, family members, ex-partners, and the conspiracy theorists go bananas thinking that they're a part of it. I don't have a lot of the hair, but my hair is probably in a house that I don't live in anymore because I go and visit my kids every once in a while.
No doubt. I mean, I've been on several trips where I've found like long women's hair on my shirts, and I'm like, that's not me.
I mean, when my daughter comes to visit and sleeps in my bed while I'm on the sofa, like I'll find her hair in my room for a year later. Like,
yes.
It's just ridiculous. And I think people want to be angry at something or someone. And
they want to target.
Yeah. And but that's what I don't understand. You have a target. He's 6'5", 250 pounds, sitting in a Suffolk County jail. There's your target. Like, the family isn't it. Now I'll go a little bit further. I do believe that they're victims until charges are laid. I do believe that they, and I'll still say this, lacked enough awareness to really empathize with the victims and the families that lost someone. And
I also think that can be shock sometimes.
Yes. And that's where Kerry and I have had.
And also sometimes having bad advisors.
Agreed. Kerry and I have had numerous conversations off the record about this, which is why when a YouTuber, Jay, The Shaming of Jay, asked if Kerry and I would be willing to go on their show and discuss this, where Kerry can represent the family of Rex, and I'm going to sort of, because I don't speak for any of the family members, but I can sort of handle this side. So we were sort of saying it, my lane, your lane, even though between each other, Kerry and I, we weren't in separate lanes. We were on the same highway, and it's just a different perspective and profound respect between the two of us for each other. And we learn from each other. We share things with each other. And that's what's missing in the general unnuanced public. That's controversial, I know.
My friends joke with me that my empathy extends to people I'm shooting arrows at. And I think that there's some truth to that idea. Like for me, you could make me as mad as humanly possible. You know, you could be dangerous to a group of people and I may have to do something to step in. I'll still have empathy for you as a human being. And I think it makes at least my world a better place. So one of the guests that I had on earlier this year, he was named Monte Frank, and he was a member of an Ojibwe tribe in Minnesota. His daughter, Nada, at 16 years old, it was in 2013, I think, she was sex trafficked. And eventually, you know, she came home, started to rebuild her life. And in 2021, her boyfriend murdered her. And, you know, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a U.S. government agency that's a part of the Department of Interior, it says that in Native communities there are probably about 4,500 missing persons cases, and they face this much higher rate of violence than others in the population. I use this as an example because you can see similar things in Hispanic communities, Black communities. Part of the reason why I use this as an example, because I think they're even more marginalized.
Agreed.
More marginalized. People just don't care. I have said this 100 times. If I talk about missing, murdered Indigenous people, my download numbers drop. And I was telling my Patreon members today that I will ride that into the grave. You know, very few articles are written about these stories. People tend to ignore the victims. I wanted to ask you before we take questions, what do you think we can do from a media perspective, from being the average citizen, to put the pressure on or to incentivize people to cover and do something about these cases that don't involve blonde hair, blue-eyed, white women?
I think it's a multifaceted problem, and the solutions are even more multifaceted. From a law enforcement perspective, I think there needs to be a lot of standardization. I think there has to be, first and foremost, empathy extended to whoever's attempting to report a missing loved one.
Do you mean standardization in terms of the process?
Yeah. Yeah, I think empathy for one. I think they have to immediately accept and put out a missing persons report. If it costs you an hour of sitting in front of a computer, then so be it. Like, there you go. There's that. I think there should be a commitment from law enforcement to communicate regularly with the family. That doesn't happen a lot. I work a lot with cold case missing families. And one that I'm very close with right now, there's been no communication for 11 years. Despite every attempt on the family, they've gotten nothing. We've certainly made tremendous inroads, and I'm not going to share it all now, but
I wonder whether, like, this is an area where the federal government could step in.
Well, they do. They offer incentives.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking like conditionalize your funding on treating people the same way, right? The federal government funds all sorts of tactical gear and other things like that. The reason why we have similar speeding limits is because the federal government says we won't give you the money if you don't make this your speeding limit.
Well, that's the same thing. In Billy's law, passed a couple of years ago, there are incentives for agencies to submit for grants for federal money to help identify unidentified. There's federal money out there to help solve cold cases. Some of these larger counties don't even have cold case squads, yet they have 100 unidentified. And trust me, I know, because I have a goddamn map full of them. And, you know, it frustrates me that I get very upset when I see a new name as entry. That's
the National Missing Persons Database.
Yeah, when I see a new unidentified go up on there and you see their date of last contact or date the body was found as 30, 40 years ago, I want to scream, like, why? Even NamUs has been around for 15 years. We ought to be faster at this process And this accountability, this sharing of information should be so much more front and center, so much more with a sense of urgency to really do something to solve these cases. We can't just, and Afram, I absolutely cherish Afram. Like, I love them so much. I was enthralled on your episode with them. But are we all just waiting for Afram to clean?
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
O'Reilly.
You've got questions? O'Reilly Auto Parts has answers. Need a pro you can trust? We've got that too. No matter what you need, our professional parts people have the training and expertise to help you do things right. Deep automotive knowledge, just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Up, I have almost 13,000 people on my map right now, and I still got another 5,000 to go. So how much can we put on one company to do? Agencies have an obligation them damn selves to solve these cases.
Well, one of the things I want to sort of turn it over to listeners' questions, and I got one in advance that I wanted to ask you. And the question was, do you believe that, 2000, was it 10 and 11, the first bodies were found?
Yeah.
There was problems between the police, the FBI, the police and themselves. Do you believe that there could have been extra, and some people speculate based on what came out in the initial charging document for him, that he could have been caught much earlier. A lot of the key information was collected earlier. Do you believe that there are victims who could have been killed?
The information that was submitted regarding the avalanche was in 2010 anyway. So if we're looking at right now,
let me just sort of, like, without that piece of it, just hone in on kind of what the listener was getting at. Do you think if the police investigation had worked well, that
I think he would have been arrested?
That could have been avoided.
I think he would have been arrested 10 years ago. Absolutely. It was corruption within Suffolk County between the district attorney and the police chief. I think that was the absolute brick wall that pushed out the FBI, that subverted anybody caring. Dominic Varone, the initial lead investigator on the case, was tossed out and, sort of threatened without his pension or whatever. And I think it was all just to protect the corruption going on between James Burke, former police chief, and Thomas Spoda, the district attorney. And they were just hiding their own dirty laundry, but they were willing to do that at the expense of allowing a serial killer to continue to be a predator on the island.
So here's a second question that flows really nicely. And it was, do you think that there were any victims that were killed after the initial bodies were found? And do you think if they, because none have been officially announced, if the person is a victim, do you think that death could have been avoided?
I think the death could have been avoided. Yes, I think there was the murder of Natasha Jugo, and in my opinion, it's a murder of Natasha Jugo in 2013, and that could easily have been avoided had law enforcement had the free reign to continue, and I'm not going to put it all on her.
She was the one who was found on West Gilgo Beach. You had told me about her. She disappeared and then was found in the same
pretty much
place
the same
months
spot
later
3 months
with
later.
no decomp.
Very little decomp.
Yeah.
And a rope wrapped around her. A rope is evident in the one redacted photo of her.
So you really do think that there's a possibility
Yes.
there?
Well,
So-
we know that once the task force had eyes on Rex, that he was still patronizing sex workers. That's a fact. That came out of their own mouths. For whatever reason, they didn't interact with him at that moment. I question the safety of those sex workers at that time, but I do trust the task force to that extent. I don't think Rex has killed anybody since 2020. I think when Geraldine Hart, the police commissioner at that time of Suffolk County, put out the picture of the WHHW belt, I think that literally scared Rex enough.
And that was the belt that they had found on Maureen.
Yeah.
And that also they match or had initials on it.
It has initials on it, but it also had hairs on them. So I think he got nervous in 2020 with the release of that information. Also, remember Valerie Mack was just identified right before that.
And didn't they find Google searches around that time on his part?
They did. Yeah.
Related to the investigation.
Yeah. So I think he was worried that something was coming, but you go to his perspective another 3 years with nothing whatsoever other than political hyperbole. In his perception, it was also in my perception that nothing was going to happen. But they were watching him. They had him. They found the evidence. This state trooper, whoever she is just an amazing individual, in my opinion. And they had it. They found him. They got him. So
and the state trooper is the one who figured out the clue about the avalanche.
The avalanche, the physical descriptions. Yep. She's the one.
Wow. So one of the things sort of Aaron asks, which I think is a great question, how do you think we can become more comfortable with our similarities with victims without becoming too fearful? So I think that's the idea that we were talking about before, that we're kind of afraid to imagine ourselves as a victim.
Yeah. It's also generational unconscious biases, right? Because we're brought up under certain strictures and perceptions and opinions of other people that are given to us by our parents and our environment and our society relative to, who we are, where we live. And, at the start of the show, I don't know if it was live yet, where I talked about how I went from selling high-end jewelry to selling sneakers. I think I began to broaden my awareness of how great people are generally. So I think to become comfortable identifying similarities with victims is to not look at them as a victim. Look at Jessica Taylor as somebody you might have known, commented on her eyes or her smile or her hairdo or her laugh, or imagine what her laugh might have been. Imagine someone who is a victim that looks like somebody you knew, or just imagine that victim is someone you knew, someone you were related to, someone you loved. And when you can start to put a victim in place of a family member of your own, a loved one of your own, then they're not a sex worker. They're not struggling with addiction. They're a young woman. They're a mom. They're a person. And I think that's how we got to start looking at. That's how it worked for me. I started looking at them as human beings, as people that loved them and that they had love for others. And then everything else becomes irrelevant.
It's so interesting you say that, because when I do, for example, the missing and murdered Indigenous people case, I imagine one of my friends who's Indigenous and it happening to her and her family losing her and her kids being taken. When I do stories on children or stories, I think I'm still a reporter, but when I talk about them, I remember this little girl who was in Manhattan and a brick randomly fell and killed her. I have people that I connect them to my life to drive that same empathy and that same sense of loss. Let me give you a chance to this has been a great conversation. Wanted to give you a chance to see if you had any closing thoughts. I really think, and I know you don't feel like you're an expert in the families. I feel like you've really given us a glimpse into what life is like and their humanity and all sorts of other things. And I know you don't speak for them. But in a way, you, like we all should, you give voice to them and to the victims. Are there any closing thoughts that you have, whether it's on that or anything else that stands out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all night, but I think I say all the time I don't speak for the victims and I can't relate to what they experience because I haven't suffered profound loss the way they did. But it doesn't mean I'm not aware of it. And it doesn't mean I don't know what they go through. And that's for them to tell that part of that story. It's not for me. I wouldn't share it even if they told me I could. It's too personal, and I don't feel, no matter how much I stand for them or advocate for their loved one, that it's just not my place to share. And I think for me, having that insight or having that knowledge or that understanding, try not to get emotional on this. This is the beauty of a relationship with someone like that. This is the trust and the respect and the honor. And it would be the same as if I shared my best friend's secrets, you know?
They've entrusted you to help tell their stories, which is unbelievably powerful, and I feel and can relate to that. But they've also done another thing, which is they've entrusted you to the parts of their stories they don't want told. And to get there and to have that moment requires such a level of deep connection and trust, especially for people who haven't always been treated well by the world.
It's true. And that's what's sad. And that's why I will stand fiercely for any of them, regardless if I have a relationship with them or not. I started standing for their loved one before I had relationships. It's what helped bridge the gap, you know, with them. And then it wasn't never my intention or goal. I never set out to cozy up to a family member. That's a burden. And I don't mean that in a negative way. And I've said this with several of them. It carries a responsibility to have a relationship with someone who's gone through such traumatic loss, and then getting, you know, ruined by the system for 10, 20 years. So it's a heavy burden for them. It's a heavy burden to often be a friend. Sometimes being a friend, it means that you're getting screamed at in the middle of the afternoon.
Yeah.
And
that's all they that's who they have.
Yeah, and that's fine. I may not be the biggest person, but my shoulders are as broad as the planet because I'll give it to them all the time. And
So I have one last question.
yeah, ask away.
How do you get the strength? Like, you said to me that you're that person who empathizes with everyone and everything. And I think a lot of us with empathy fear we're not going to have the strength to get through things like this that are so emotional and so hard, much less being yelled at by
Yeah,
someone. Where do you get that from?
I think strength and empathy are two separate things. I have recently been challenged an awful lot, and I didn't know if I had the strength for it. But empathy is self-fulfilling. It's regenerative. It'll always be
Maybe
there.
it's where the strength comes from.
I believe that is it. I think it is who I am in my core. I'm an empathetic person. People call me a simp or people call me all these names. I don't care. At the end of the day, I value my commitment to victims, my commitment to the families. And that's just in the LISK case. There's people behind me, Dawn and Dawn. There's almost 13,000 people on the map. I just empathy is bottomless. It's endless. It is all fulfilling. It is all around. It is like oxygen. It's always there. All you have to do is tap into it and make it work for you. And that's what I try to do.
That makes sense. All right, Raul, I wanted to thank you and go ahead and close out. Much appreciated. I'm really grateful that you came on.
I'm honored to be asked to be on. I appreciate it. I'm always humbled by it. It isn't easy to sometimes to talk about the things we talk about, to be vulnerable in front of countless numbers of people and for posterity, because people years from now may see all of this. And it's still just, from my soul, is the right thing to do. And I really only do it with the right people. I turn down requests all the time and I say yes rarely. So the people that I do engage with, the people that I advocate for, the people that I'll moderate for or engage with, they just mean a little bit more to me. And you're certainly one of them, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, guys. Thanks for joining us as well, by the way. I've already taken enough of Raul's time. I did not think this would be one of those ones where I was planning on doing one episode and I got 2 episodes, but this feels like one of those 2 episodes or episode and bonus episode kind of thing. But I think it's just such a truly important topic. I was literally talking about this today. I don't know if you've heard yet the little Patreon bonus that I dropped. But I don't care if everyone hates me and hates my podcast. I am going to do these stories and these stories and these stories until we have one listener, which might be me.
I'll always listen.
Yeah. So two. All right. All right. Thanks, everybody. We will see you soon. As Raul said, we should say their names. So I'm going to say their names right now. Melissa Bartholomew, Amber Lynn Castillo, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, Jessica Taylor, Sandra Castillo, Valerie Mack, Female Toddler, Asian Doe, Andre Jamal Isaacs, Peaches, Karen Vergata, in the case that sparked the investigation, Shannon Gilbert. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with us and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations like this one with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again next week. Thanks for staying until the end. Before you go, I want to let you know about a true crime podcasting meetup we're going to be holding at the Hotel Ivy in downtown Minneapolis on Saturday, December 7th from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. We'll be doing a live show with some great true crime podcasts, have guests from the forensic science firm Othram and the Gabby Petito Foundation, advocates, and some fun events. We're also going to do a live investigation of an actual case. If you're interested, you can go to our Facebook page to find the event sign up or to www.silverliningshandbook.com to sign up there. There's no cost, and we hope to see you.
Build up to Black Friday with savings all month long at Lowe's. Get up to 50% off select major appliances, plus take an additional 10% off when you buy select major appliances. And don't wait to pick up holiday inflatables under $20. Don't wait to save, in-store or online now, because Lowe's knows deals. Valid 11/6 through 12/4. Cannot be combined with additional discounts. See Lowe's.com for details and qualifying items while supplies last.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be.